Sometime in April last year, our family moved to Cape Cod. Our daughter was working at the special COVID hospital set up at the Boston Convention Center, and we needed to live separately in those early days of the pandemic when so many Bostonians were dying, and we weren't even sure how COVID was spread. I've always loved Cape Cod. On the outer Cape, the beach has been preserved, undeveloped as the national seashore, and it runs along the Atlantic uninterrupted for 40 miles. It's all public, and one can walk long distances, often in solitude. On those beaches, staring out into the Atlantic Ocean, listening to the rhythmic waves, I become right-sized again. The waves roll in and out without my tug. I learn my place as a visitor to the home of seals and sharks. And on that spit of sandbar, left behind by glaciers 18,000 years ago, I recall that I'll live but for a flicker of time, small in the immensity of the universe. But if I stay long enough with that pure gift of salty air in my lungs and fresh wind on my face, I know one thing more, that I'm alive and live in an astonishing world with the divine present and palpable. I am not alone. The natural world last spring was saving me in the midst of COVID's upheaval. Yet we know in other places, nature was wreaking havoc. More hurricanes than ever devastated the South this year. Massive wildfires raged on the West Coast in Australia, and freezing temperatures led to deaths in Texas just last week. While nature is beyond our control, wasn't humankind complicit in those tragedies because we failed to rein in Earth's rising temperatures? This pandemic has given us time and forced us to examine issues and ourselves more deeply. One result is that a group from our church has become determined to tackle climate change, and we'll be making suggestions for how to make our own homes ecologically sustainable, our church buildings green, and how together we can support more systemic change. Because we're tackling this issue of climate change as a church, today I want to focus on the spiritual issues at stake. Spiritually, what went wrong to bring us here to a planet in crisis? What does our faith ask of us now? Is there anything preventing us from going out and getting the job that's needed done? Will our spiritual resolve be what does sustain us and makes all the difference? As I've read, I identified two spiritual questions that I think are central. First, how do you see the relationship between God and humans and the rest of nature? Is there a hierarchy with God on top and then humans and then every other living creature and the rest of nature? Or are God, humans, and the rest of nature all inextricably intertwined? God in us and in all nature, and we living surrounded by the holy. The second spiritual issue, where does individualism fall in your value system? As to that first, Christians began re-examining the relationship between God and humans and the rest of nature after the 1970s environmental movement began. Many of us who are older grew up in church hearing from Genesis that God created man to subdue the earth and have dominion over it. Some who came after us interpreted the text somewhat more gently as requiring humans to steward the earth rather than subdue it. Stewarding meant humans should also care for the planet, preserving it for its future use, not to have dominion solely for our own immediate needs. But both of those readings still assume some kind of a hierarchy with human primacy over all other creation, either to have dominion over it or to steward it. So it was important when a third understanding of the relations between God and humans and other life on the planet regained traction early in this century after a long hiatus. This view says that there is no hierarchy in creation, for it's all beloved by God. Rather, it's known mainly by an interdependence between humans and the rest of nature, and God is infused among it all, within us, surrounding us, enfolding us. We, in turn, live within the divine, seen in the cosmos all around us. Today, this is the writing and the lived experience of Franciscan Richard Rohr and the theologian Sally McFague. It also is a major theme of the late Howard Thurman, former dean of Boston University's March Chapel. He wrote a beautiful piece saying that when he was a boy, he often had time out in a rowboat by himself in a river fishing. And he knew, as the hours stretched on, the very real presence of God there. Catholic theologian Elizabeth Johnson argues that this interweaving of God, humans, and all of nature was actually a standard understanding of Christians for the first 1,500 years. But after that time, until quite recently, Christianity seems to have lost creation as a central part of our talk about God. Before 1500, Johnson explains, it was taken for granted that God's good creation was a revealing path to the knowledge of God. Augustine said God had given us two books, the book of sacred scripture, the Bible, and the book of nature. If we learn to read the book of nature all right, we will hear God's true word and be led to knowledge about God's wisdom, power, and love. Aquinas thought the whole creation, the whole cosmos, was an image of God. After about 1500, however, the natural world seems to have dropped out of religious conversation, which became increasingly fixated on the human and God alone. Nature somehow came to be considered fallen, and those who found God's presence in nature could be accused of paganism. Didn't help that Galileo in the 1600s and the Jesuit priest Pierre Teilhard Chardin just in the mid-1900s. Both were sanctioned for challenging the prevailing church view on nature. But just recently, return to the earlier understandings began. Science was revealing the astonishing nature of our vast cosmos with constantly new discoveries. So Aquinas' maxim was resurrected that the whole cosmos reveals the image of God. And science also began documenting, though, the harms to our planet from pollution and plastics and nuclear waste and toxic chemicals. These two developments taken together meant that if the cosmos is the full image of God, God's very being, then our disregard for its majesty is sacrilege. Harm to the earth is contempt for God's own body. The Bible, arguably, supports all three theologies, human dominion and human stewardship and interdependence. We know that the Bible contains two separate creation stories, both in Genesis, written by different groups. The first, that lyrical version of creation written by the priestly class, says that over the first 5 days, God brought order from chaos, created the heavens and the earth, and made all creatures and other living things. God saw that these were good, but on the sixth day, God's culminating work was the grand creation of humankind made in God's own image. Then God declares humans are very good. A hierarchy of favor is clearly being written by the priestly hierarchy. Just as God, who is above all, tames chaos to bring order to the universe, humans, made highest of all creation, are tasked with taming everything else. Rather conveniently for the priestly writers, it also follows that among humans, those highest in the chain, the priestly class, will establish priestly rules and rituals to tame the chaos of the wider human community. Clear pecking orders needed, in their view, God, priests, people, and all other nature. But the second biblical creation story in Genesis was written by farmers who lived in the small patches of arable land in ancient Israel, either near a water source or atop the hills. And in that second story, creation is a beautiful, lush garden, every farmer's dream. But this time, all living things spring from the soil. Plants grow from it, but God also creates animals and human beings from the soil by breathing life into the dirt. Adam is earthman. In this second creation story, humans are not superior to the rest of creation, but made of the same dirt as all other living things. This vision comports more with a non-hierarchical interweaving among God and humans and the rest of nature. Where do you stand? Can you imagine the divine as other than anthropomorphic? Could God be encompassing all of creation, treasuring all of it, living in and through it? Or do humans remain at the center of your understanding, uniquely empowered by the Creator God to use nature's gifts as we discern? How does this affect your view of whether climate change is a spiritual issue? The second main consideration I want us to consider is where you stand on individualism, a high value in middle-class North America now. Around 1500, just as nature was no longer being included in the study of God, in the Christian West, a new understanding of God's will for human flourishing began to form. With the advent of the printing press and spread of new ideas, the Protestant Reformation and then the Enlightenment, individualism and individual rights grew in importance. In church, Protestants argued that they, as individuals, had the right to commune directly with God without the mediation of a priest. In the new American democracy, the Declaration of Independence declared the rights of white landed men, given inalienably by their Creator, rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are the rights of individuals to pursue their own life, liberty, and happiness. Around that same time, in 1776, in economics, Adam Smith, father of capitalist market theory, declared each individual should pursue his or her individual self-interest. And then neutral market forces, the invisible hand, would maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. Notice, under Adam Smith's individualism, the sin of individual human greed would be transformed into the common good and a growing economy for all. Notice, under the new American Republic, self-interested votes would be mediated by a shared national commitment to democracy. With notable exceptions during the age of the robber barons and after the Depression, Americans have not always felt the need to restrain individual greed. Our capitalist system has led to enormous growth and lifestyle comfort for Americans, although unevenly delivered. And individual rights are important for those subjected to tyrants, those in the minority of opinion, those limited to an inherited job and a caste system. These advances were and are significant. But now we reckon with the results of unfettered individualism, self-interest, and material goods. We now know that air and water are scarce resources. The energy consumption fueling our growth impacts the heat of the planet. Decisions by individuals in America have enormous consequences for those of other nations, especially those most vulnerable to climate change, who may become economic refugees. So the second spiritual question is, what are the limits to individualism? How does this high American value align with Christ's teaching to love our neighbor just the way we love ourselves? Remember today's scripture. Jesus has just asked Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answers, "You are the Messiah." He gets the A+. Imagine how that exchange with Jesus was for Peter. His friend was the one for whom Jews had been waiting for centuries, who would now bring down the Romans, bring back Israel as it had been during King David's time, unified, respected, mighty. But Jesus interrupts Peter's daydream by doing this very odd thing. Jesus began to teach that he, the Messiah, would be rejected by all the Jewish religious leaders. He would be killed, and then somehow he would rise again. So Peter calls Jesus over. What are you doing? Look, you can be straight with me because I know who you are. Stop saying that stuff about being killed. No one's going to kill the Messiah. You'll just scare people away with talk like that. And Jesus has to respond, "Peter, now you get an F. You're acting like an adversary. Get behind me and follow me and do what I must do, or go home. I am going to be rejected and killed." It's what happens to those who ally with the oppressed, who go against the way things are, who tell those in power that they're wrong. Leaders want to keep their power and their riches. But God thinks abundance is meant for all, wants a new way of understanding abundance. And then Jesus begins telling the whole larger group, the reason behind life, the reason behind all of creation is so that all in the cosmos may thrive and live abundantly. But the measure of abundance is not what we've been trained to understand, measured by money or material things. Real life, real abundance is about whether you leave this world better off by having lived. Whether you taught a child or brought peace to relationships or gladdened hearts with art or made life sustainable for anything struggling to live, if you invented something that helps, but to make a difference for others, not just for yourself, you must deny yourselves and live a cruciform life. The rich must live more simply so that the poor can simply live. Jesus tells them all, this message is threatening because it questions the foundation of our economy. Capitalism assumes we all consume as much as we can and the economy will grow for everyone. It's worked for decades, making North America envied by most of the world. Lifestyle where we enjoy new clothes and individual cars and electricity, homes with indoor plumbing, heat, air conditioning, though all these things are very unevenly distributed. And our North American lifestyle comes at a cost to the environment and other people. We will need to deny ourselves, to use less power, to take more public transportation, to purchase less, to eat less, to live in smaller spaces. And leaders won't want to stop the way of life that's brought us all status and comfort, especially if it's to help people in other nations. America first. But those who are intent on real abundance in the deepest sense will set aside status and comfort in order to make the world better for all. Why cling to your current status and comfort if it means you'll never get true abundant joy? Those who will save their lives will lose them. But those who will lose their lives for Christ's sake will save.